The House and Senate passed a bill to raise the debt ceiling and cap government spending for the next 2 years. I'm Rosemary Miller here with Kelly Phillips Erb, a tax lawyer and Forbes editor. Thank you so much for joining me, Kelly.
Thank you for having me.
So, Kelly, this is clearly a bipartisan bill, and we don't see that a lot these days. Can you tell us why do you think this was a bipartisan bill?
I think there are two factors. I think one is that although there was a lot of posturing by both sides, ultimately they both understood that the results of not suspending or raising the debt ceiling could be pretty devastating for the economy. It would mean that the United States would default on its bills, and that's something we've never done in the modern era. So I think both parties saw the value in reaching an agreement. So I think that's part of it. And I also, I give a lot of credit to President Biden and Representative or House Speaker McCarthy, who sat down and kind of, hammered out these details before it went to the floor. They came to an agreement. I think it was something that, again, you heard a lot of grumbling about when it happened, but ultimately both sides saw that it was something that was going to be acceptable to their parties, and so they moved forward. So I think it was both, the spirit of understanding how important it was, and then a lot of behind the scenes work that kind of propelled it forward.
So, could you tell us what's actually in this bill? I know in your story you had about 11 points of things we need to know. What are those things?
Sure. Well, I think the one thing that we should kind of mention is that people were kind of confused about the spending part, right? So I think people kind of conflated this with, are they working out the budget? They weren't working out the budget. What they were doing is they were putting restraints on spending, which is a little different. So this isn't like a line by line budget, but they did address some very specific spending areas. So one that got a lot of play before the bills went was Medicaid. There was a lot of pull on the GOP side that they wanted to have a work requirement for Medicaid put into place. And that did not happen. So there was no change to Medicaid funding. However, the work requirement did find its way into other funding, specifically SNAP funding. And SNAP is what we call it, like in everyday chatter, we call it food stamps. It's basically assistance to families for food. And there are existing work requirements, but there is a lower cutoff age-wise. So this would actually expand it. It's quite a narrow window. I think ages 50 to 54 over the next few years. But what it also did was it carved out some exceptions. And that was, again, that was a bipartisan agreement that if they're gonna have additional work requirements, then we should do something to make sure that the people that are the most vulnerable are protected. And so there are protections in place for vets, for example, homeless persons and foster youth. So those folks were insulated from the changes, but overall, SNAP, there are now work requirements.
Okay, so Kelly, what about the TANF benefits? You mentioned that in your story as well.
Sure. So TAMP was another point of contention where there was a lot of concern about who was going to get what. And the TAMP program is interesting because it's a federal program, but it gives money to states to distribute. And the concern was that states weren't meeting certain targets, and that there were also maybe those targets were a bit too low at this point. So what happened on the federal side, which is just more programmatic than it is actual dollar limits, is that the Fed said to the states, we are going to require you to change the way that you report, and we're also going to look at the numbers before we give you the money. So it's not, again, it's not they didn't take a red line and say we're going to eliminate $100 million from this program. They just changed the way that they're going to be distributing those funds, and as a result that should keep a little bit of a cap on spending.
So, what about Medicaid? I'm sure a lot of people are concerned about that.
Yeah, the Medicaid, they did have a work requirement that the GOP was pushing for, but ultimately there was no change to Medicaid at all.
No change to Medicaid. So, could you talk a bit about student loans? I know the student loan pause is ending at the end of the summer. I'm sure there are a lot of concerns when it comes to that.
Right. So the student loan, there were two parts that people were concerned about. One was the student loan pause, and then the other was the cancellation. There's no mention in this bill at all of the cancellation, and that's largely because it's already at the Supreme Court and there's going to be a decision this summer. So there's no point in addressing it until there's some clarity from the Supreme Court on cancellation. But with respect to the pause, there was an order that allowed students that had certain kinds of student loans to not have to pay those while the pandemic was happening, and then that was going to carry forward a bit. There was no actual end date that had been, very definitely decided until this bill, which would actually put in pause. I think the requirements were, I think it said 60 days from June 30th, which basically brings it into August. And so students who had been on pause will have to resume those payments. Interestingly, when the Congressional Budget Office did their scoring to see like what the impact would be on the economy of that happening from the pause, they actually said that it would not affect spending. I think there was again some posturing that suggested that this was going to bring like huge amounts of money into the government. But while it does accelerate the payments, it doesn't actually change the number of the payments.
Okay. So speaking of spending, what about the unspent COVID funds?
Right. So this was also a point of contention because there is money still available for certain kinds of COVID programs that were set up during the pandemic. And that money is being clawed back. So this is not money that has been distributed to, say, taxpayers, but it's typically money that's sitting in federal agencies that were earmarked for COVID relief that's being brought back.
So, Kelly, you talked about timing, and the debt limit has been suspended through 2025. And in your story, you mentioned that that was pretty interesting because people only expected it to be suspended for the next few months. Could you talk about that?
Right. So the debt limit's actually been suspended or raised many times since it began. So this is not a discussion that's new. And as we mentioned earlier, it can also be very political. And this year in particular is very political. So there is a real advantage to making sure that we can pay our bills. And again, everybody appreciated that. But there was some posturing that suggested that they weren't going to make this easy, right? And the timing therefore mattered because next year is a presidential election. So it carries a lot of importance for both parties. And there were some suggestions that it might be just a short-term fix and that we'd have this discussion again and maybe again. I think it's significant that it was extended to 2025 because that means that we're not going to have this same set of discussions until after the elections. So I think that is I think it's good for the country, but I also think it was beneficial because it put a lot of pressure on both parties to make sure that this was a deal that addressed a number of issues, that were going to be long term. I mean, long term being relative in politics, 2 years is long term. So, it did. I think it was a very interesting timeline that surprised a lot of people.
Okay. So, what else do we need to know about this bill?
I think it's worth noting that, again, I think sometimes people don't always understand what the debt ceiling is, even though it's about controlling spending. It's not necessarily budget. So I did get a lot of questions on social media asking me, what does this mean for taxpayers? And are we going to see new taxes? And so I can answer that question easily, that there are no new taxes. This didn't institute any new taxes. One of the things it does do, though, that does impact taxpayers is it does claw back some of the money that was given to the IRS under the Inflation Reduction Act. And really interesting is that we saw a lot of numbers being bandied about before we actually saw the text of the bill. The text of the bill is 99 pages long. The text of the bill actually only claws back about 1.4 billion from IRS. But people have probably heard both the president and McCarthy talking about 20 billion. And so that seems a little confusing. And the 20 billion is sort of a side agreement almost, where the number that's actually in the bill is the 1.4 billion that's being pulled back. But the additional 20 billion would be taken from spending for the next 2 fiscal years from IRS and reallocated to other non-defense spending. So I think that's worth understanding that there was going to be this influx of money to IRS. There's still money there. We're probably just not going to see it as quickly as folks anticipated. I also think it's interesting. There was a lot of a lot of discussion about military spending. Military spending and vet care spending both remained pretty much as anticipated. You're going to have people say they didn't spend enough, and you're going to have people say that they spent too much. But it was pretty much in line with the presidential budget proposal. So I don't think there were any surprises on military or vet care spending. I think where the most impact is going to be felt is that they did impose caps on spending for the next 2 years, which means that for domestic non-defense related spending, there are going to have to be some cuts, and so that's going to be something I think we're going to see more when we talk about the budget, because who gets what piece of which cuts, that's something that isn't addressed directly in this agreement. That's going to be something that has to be hammered out. But there are some provisions that, if they don't come to an agreement, would automatically cut spending. So, I think both sides, although again, I understand there's going to be some grumbling, but I think both sides can feel pretty good about what they put forth. And I think you see that when you see the votes, because in the House, the votes were 314 to 117. That's pretty remarkable. I mean, that's definitely a bipartisan effort. And in the Senate, the Senate is very narrowly controlled, and the Senate vote was 63 to 36. So again, I think that those were both indicative of the idea that both parties wanted to see this done. We did not want to default on our obligations. That would not be good for the U.S. to not pay our bills, and it would have ramifications down the road. So on the taxpayer side, no new taxes. There will be some cuts in spending. We're going to find out how much those impact us, over, I'm sure, the next few months. But I think overall, everybody can kind of, relax and breathe a little, knowing that, the lights aren't going to shut off tomorrow.
That is a good feeling. Thank you so much for joining me today, Kelly.
Thank you.